It'll just take a moment. So I hope you can now see my slides. Just to say that I'm very happy to take questions during the course of my talk, or if you have uncertainty about the English or whatever, please ask me. But I can't see pictures of all of you. So if you raise your hand, I may not see that you've raised your hand, and perhaps Melissa, you would see it and you could stop me if necessary, so that I can address that
Yes.
question.
Sorry, just one. If you feel that we don't see your raise your hand, please put something in the chat and just say, I've got a question, and then we'll try to get your question across.
Yeah, that'd be great. So I'm particularly pleased too that this session is on mental health and behaviour, because as I think all of you know, really it is one of the most significant concerns for families and for professional social care providers who support people with Prader-Willi syndrome. It also comes at, I think, an interesting time from an IPSWO, from the international perspective. We have recently set up a mental health initiative in which we're bringing together families, psychologists, psychiatrists, and many other health professionals from across the world to try and develop our understanding of behavior problems and the mental health problems that are experienced by people with Prader-Willi syndrome. It's one of the commonest questions we get asked in IPSWO, and I'm sure as a national association, you're always getting questions from your membership about how do you manage difficult behavior or whatever it happens to be. Now, I've thought quite a lot about this webinar and what the content should be. The problem really is that this is a topic with no single or straightforward solutions. Now, if I was an endocrinologist, I could tell you about how growth hormones should be used or how sex hormones should be used to replace those that are low in someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. But it just isn't as straightforward as that when it comes to behavior and mental health. The interventions are complex. They include environmental change. Sorry, I didn't mean to change at that point. I'm just going to go back for a sec. It includes environmental changes, psychological interventions, medical treatments, and so on. And often the interventions may not be directly with the person with Prader-Willi syndrome, him or herself. It may be through you as parents or those of you who are professional support providers. All these things make it much more complex, but it also makes it more complex in a sense to give a presentation about it. And then I thought to myself, well, you as parents or professional care providers will be the expert when it comes to your son or daughter or the person you're supporting with Prader-Willi syndrome. And perhaps what I can best do as someone who's been a clinician and a researcher in this field is really to set out for you what I've called a sort of conceptual framework, a way of how you might understand mental ill health and the behavior problems of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and really try and address the question, why do such problems such as hyperphagia, so overeating, and emotional outbursts occur? And then ultimately, what is the implication of that understanding for how you intervene and how you might treat and prevent these problems? So that's my approach, and I hope by the end of this talk you will go away with a sense that you have a better understanding of why these things occur and therefore what you might do about it. I want to start, however, by just being very clear that because people with Prader-Willi syndrome have many strengths, because one of the dangers of a talk such as this is inevitably I will be focusing on what one might see as the negative aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome, because that's what you've asked me to address. And as a psychiatrist, the reason I get asked to see people with Prader-Willi syndrome It's not because of their positive aspects, it's because of the problems that they present with. So that will inevitably be the focus of this talk. I think the other point to make really at the beginning of this talk is the life expectancy of this baby here with Prader-Willi syndrome and the opportunities available to that baby. In many countries of the world now, I do genuinely believe will be a lot better than it was, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Sadly, of course, that is not true for other countries in the world, for many countries in the world, where Prader-Willi syndrome may not even be recognized, let alone readily diagnosed. And if you look at this young man here, and he was someone who was part of our vagus nerve study, and I will be talking about that a bit later, life is good for him. He's slim because he lives in an environment where, and he agrees to this, where access to food is controlled, so he doesn't eat too much. He has a full and active life with good physical activity and lots of opportunities. And actually, since starting the stimulation, which is done through this little device here, his behavior has been much better, and that's made a big difference for him. So with those qualifications, if you like, what I want to do is, in this talk, is firstly say something about the terminology that is used in this field. You know, mental health, mental ill health, what I've called behaviors of concern, or sometimes referred to as challenging behaviors, mental illness or psychosis. What do these things mean? But I want to start by saying that I've used the term mental ill health to refer to both those behaviors that we all recognize, such as emotional outbursts, as well as to mental illness when it occurs. It's a sort of generic term that covers all these things. And then I want to focus on what is the causation, what might be causing these problems. And I'm going to really focus on three, I think, aspects of this. One is to say something about our knowledge now, increasing knowledge of the atypical and delayed brain development that you see in people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and the implications of that in terms of how we understand these behavior problems and mental ill health. I'm going to say something about the cognitive and social impairments that are also a consequence of the atypical brain development, but also a key message that I think will come throughout my talk is that the way we increasingly understand these problems of mental ill health is that it is a relationship between a vulnerability because of the impaired brain development on the one hand, and environmental circumstances on the other. There is this interaction between, if you like, a brain that is vulnerable and an environment that then might trigger and sustain the behavior problems when they occur. And I'm going to then move on and look at the implications for this type of model for how we understand these behavior difficulties in people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and focus both on prevention and treatment. So I want to start by taking a step back and actually asking what we mean by mental health. And the World Health Organization, the WHO, I think has done a lot of really interesting work in this area. I'm a great fan of the WHO. It's a large and complex organization, but it really has made great contributions to the field of mental health. And they're very clear that we should see good mental health as more than the absence of a mental disorder. So it is more, it is a positive thing. It includes emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And perhaps the best way of thinking about this is that it's very analogous in a sense to physical health. We don't think of someone as physically healthy simply because they don't have a physical illness. We see physical health as being more than the absence of a physical illness. We see it as being physically able, being able to take exercise, being able to do those things that we want to do, and not having limitations because of our physical abilities. Well, mental health is the same. And these phrases here are taken from this paper by Galtasaari, who was sort of talking about the new way of thinking about mental health. It's about being able to recognize emotions in others. It's about being part of society and being a social person, being able to interact with others, being able to cope with adverse events and to function socially. And if you think about these more general terms, I think you can see how people with Prader-Willi syndrome have difficulties with them. And it's this, therefore, that I want to reflect on and think about more generally. But I want to start by looking at more generally at well-being and the environment that someone with Prader-Willi syndrome lives in. And much of this is true for all of us, that our well-being, how we feel in ourselves, depends upon a number of things, not only our mental and physical health, but it depends upon our family relationships, our upbringing, our relationships with our parents and all that sort of thing, the living environment we're in. Now, in some ways, of course, for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, there are additional issues here that are important. We, of course, need to recognize the individual strengths of a person with Prader-Willi syndrome. And I think often I'm amazed about how well they cope with the challenges that they have in what is, as you get older, certainly, an increasingly demanding and sophisticated world that we all live in. And it's very tough if you don't always have the cognitive abilities or emotional resilience to cope with the demands of such an environment. But also, of course, there's the issue of making certain that someone with Prader-Willi syndrome has a healthy weight and is physically active, and that they have the opportunities and needs that they wish for, and that address the issues related to having Prader-Willi syndrome. But there's this section here, which I've called dimensions of mental ill health. And this is something that has arisen in the discussions that we've had within the IPSWO mental health initiative that I mentioned earlier. And we refer to these things that I will be talking about in a moment as dimensions rather than categories, if you like. So if we take hyperphagia, for example, hyperphagia isn't just necessarily there or not there. There are gradations of hyperphagia. And so it's better to think of these things as a dimension, as a spectrum, than as a category which is either present or not present. Because within the population of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, there is considerable variation. So that's why the term dimensions has been used. And when you begin to think about what we've called here the dimensions of mental ill health, I think one starts with the brain. And one starts with the fact that there is something about inheriting the genetic abnormality that we recognize now as being the genotype of Prader-Willi syndrome, the chromosome 15 abnormality, whether it's the UPD or the deletion or the imprinting center defect. There's something about that that leads to atypical brain development. We don't understand exactly why that is, why the absence of expression of these particular genes does that. But I think firstly, because of the evidence of the cognitive impairments, we know that brain development is atypical and delayed. But we also know from neuroimaging studies, brain scanning studies, that the structure of the brain is atypical. And that affects the cortex, the surface of the brain, which is very important for cognition and consciousness. But as you will know, it particularly affects this area of the brain, a tiny nucleus, which is right in the brain just about there, called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus and its nerve connections to the rest of the brain, and also some other connections called neuroendocrine connections. This is clearly abnormal in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, it is the fact that I think having this atypical brain development brings with it certain risks. some of those risks are not manifest until something in the environment happens that brings out the problem, a temper outburst, or whatever it happens to be, skin picking develops. And here are really these dimensions that contribute to mental ill health. There's the impairments around cognition, communication, and social functioning. And I will go into some of these in a little more detail. But for some people with Prader-Willi syndrome, it might amount to meeting the criteria for an autistic spectrum condition, for example. For other people, it might be much more around their intellectual impairment or their cognitive inflexibility. But there's a whole range here of impairments that are important in trying to understand some of the behaviors. And as will become clear as I go through the talk, what the environmental changes are about are trying to provide some compensation because of those impairments. And then there are what we've called behaviors of concern. So the hyperphagia, the overeating, the emotional and temper outbursts. Here we've used the phrase body-focused self-harming because it isn't just skin picking. For example, it can be rectal picking, but then repetitive and ritualistic behaviors, rigidity, and so on. Now, these here are not always immediately recognizable, but they can be assessed and they can be picked up on cognitive tests. These here are often apparent to those that are caring for someone. It's apparent that someone has outbursts. But these abnormalities of mental state, they may present with changes in behavior and abnormalities of behavior. But often they require some insight on the part of the person themselves, the ability to say that they're feeling depressed or that they're experiencing some abnormal mental belief or experiences. And this can be sometimes problematic. And I'll come back to some of these issues during the course of this talk. But I hope that this sort of, in a way, sets the scene a bit for how we now begin to look at why these things occur and what you might do about them. So this atypical and delayed brain development in people with Prader-Willi syndrome, I think has two major consequences to it, really. One is what I've called here this impaired ability to regulate. And this often goes by a term called homeostasis. Homeostasis is the ability of the brain to regulate the body and our behavior in order to keep us fit and alive and well in the context of our environment. It's something that has been shaped through evolution over many years. And I've given just some examples here of part of this process of homeostasis. It's absolutely essential to life. So food intake should match your energy expenditure. So we have developed as an animal, as a human animal, in order that we by and large eat as much as we need to compensate for the energy that we've used through exercise and to keep our body going and so on. But of course, this is a problem for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. They don't appear to be able to do that. They don't stop their eating when they've eaten enough calories to match how many calories that they have used. And this is what leads to hyperphagia, and I'll come back to that. But another aspect that is often not thought of as part of homeostasis, but I think it is that we have also evolved to respond in an effective and an efficient way when we feel we're under threat. So if we feel that someone is out to attack us or whatever, and this is going back, in evolutionary time, that our hypothalamus and what's known as the autonomic nervous system of the body has responded to help us, has developed to help us respond to threat in an appropriate way. And again, I think this is where things are problematic, and this has led to this increased risk of emotional outbursts. And the same, I think, can be true for mood, that our mood is generally regulated, so it keeps it within a tight bound. We feel unhappy and depressed when it's appropriate to do so, but not so much so that it incapacitates us. And if if unhappiness becomes a serious mood disorder, that incapacitates us, and that's not good for survival. And that's again all about homeostasis. And here's a very obvious example. Homeostasis is about regulating temperature. If you're in a cold environment, you shiver, and if you're in a hot environment, you sweat. And we know that this is a problem for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. This is, a very obvious example. And then the second way that I think the brain, impaired brain development, is the cognitive skills that I've mentioned, and I'll come back to. But I think what it has done is it means that it's quite difficult for people with Prader-Willi syndrome to have an accurate understanding of the world. If you can't easily recognize the emotions being expressed by someone else, then it's difficult to know the intent of that person. And that's, an important social skill, is to be able to read social cues and things. And whilst that might not matter so much in childhood, that becomes increasingly important in adult life. This now takes us, I'm going to just take us, if you like, a step back a bit, having tried to explain the issues of brain development and what the problems that leads to, is that in many countries over a number of years now, there have been studies that have looked at the behavioral and mental health problems that are particularly a problem for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And these studies have been done in your country, they've been done in the UK, in North America, Australia, and so on. And of course, you will, as parents particularly, will recognize almost all of these. Hyperphagia being the most significant one, probably affects everyone, but just to stress that it can vary in degree. It can vary in degree in the same person over time, and it can vary certainly in degree between people with Prader-Willi syndrome. Some families will say, I've always had to lock the food cupboard. Other families will say, we don't need to do that. Then there's the repetitive and ritualistic behaviors that I mentioned, sometimes referred to as obsessive compulsive behaviors, the temper outburst, the skin picking, what I've called non-psychotic mood disorders. So these are things like being depressed and low, or being a bit high, sometimes referred to as hypomania or mania. And then there's psychotic illness, which is particularly a problem in people with the UPD form of Prader-Willi syndrome. So these are the issues that research is trying to explain, but also they're the issues that you as family members have to cope with, and I as a psychiatrist to get asked to see people for. So I really want to now look in a little more detail at some of these things. This is a review that Joyce Whittington and I did. It was published in 2019. And we looked at all the research looking at the cognitive impairments and the social impairments that people with Prader-Willi syndrome had. And I'll come back to the issue of IQ in a moment. But what I really wanted to mention, because I think often these things are not given enough attention, and that is what's sometimes referred to as higher order cognitive abilities. These are the skills that become particularly important as you get older and begin to lead a more adult life. There are things like what's called executive function. These are cognitive abilities that are controlled by the frontal areas of the brain, the large frontal lobe of the brain. But they include, importantly, the ability to plan. And if you think about one of the things that people with Prader-Willi syndrome have is difficulty planning. There's also issues around, for example, concept of time. And planning requires an understanding not only of space, but also of time. It's three-dimensional in that way. And this is a complex problem for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. You and I take that for granted, but for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, that's difficult. Or theory of mind, the ability to make judgments about the feelings that other people have, or how your behavior will make other people feel. A very important part of being able to mix and socialize with others. The recognition of emotional expressions. Things like what's called working memory, to be able to hold things in your memory whilst you work out solutions. Planning, I've mentioned. A very important thing is attention or switching tasks. It's sometimes very difficult for people with Prader-Willi syndrome to suddenly change from one task to another. But you and I know that this is an essential part of life. You can't control always the things that happen in your environment. And there are also problems in terms of what I've called educational attainments, numerical skills, reading comprehension, expressive or receptive language. These may be subtle, they may not be obvious, as these may be subtle. There's just a note of caution here that a lot of these studies were done some years ago, and the people who were part of these studies may not have been on growth hormone early. They may have had periods of being very obese. They may not have always had educational opportunities. So I think in a way we can't be certain that these issues will be as marked as they are in an older group of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, in this younger group who are growing up perhaps in a better life, with a better life, better educational opportunities, and on growth hormone. And we know growth hormone does have an effect on cognition. So one just has to be careful. I'm sure these issues are still a problem, but they may not be quite as severe as some of the research suggests they can be. Now this slide, I use this slide really partly to talk about IQ. And IQ, which is a standard way of measuring intellect or intellectual functioning. And in the general population, a standard IQ test usually has a mean or an average IQ of 100. And both in studies we've done and other people show that if you look at a population of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, their mean IQ of the population is around 60. It's 40 points below. But it's distributed around the mean. So there are going to be some people here who have IQs that are well within what you'd expect for the general population, above 70, for example. And this can be a problem in some cases, because often that's interpreted as meaning the person doesn't have an intellectual disability. And certainly in my country, the UK, having an intellectual disability is a requirement in order to get into certain services. And so when someone with Prader-Willi syndrome is found to have an IQ of 75, people say they don't have an intellectual disability and therefore they don't have the right of access to intellectual disability services. But there will also be some people with Prader-Willi syndrome that have IQs at a much lower level. So again, it comes back to the idea of dimensions. You can't say that everyone with Prader-Willi syndrome, obviously they don't have the same IQ, but there will be a spectrum there. And the same is probably true for many of these other intellectual and cognitive abilities that I mentioned a moment ago. There will be a spectrum. I think is someone holding up a hand or not? Maybe not. I think that, no, it's
Jack.
not. No, it's a plant, I think, that's drifting into the screen.
Oh, right. Yes, it looks as if Jack is asking a question. No, somebody else is. Okay.
I think the other point to make, which I have made already really, is that some of these cognitive impairments are hidden and are not always readily apparent. But it's important you know about them. So the impact of these cognitive impairments is clearly on learning and on educational attainments. And there is some data to suggest that it's harder for people with Prader-Willi syndrome to maintain their skills over time. It makes it difficult for them to reliably interpret and make sense of the physical and social environment. And it makes it more difficult for them to respond to and make decisions about how they should respond in an efficient and effective way. So you can see how that impacts on their mental health. If we think about mental health being the ability to be social, to cope with the social environment. I now want to move to something a bit different. And I want to ask, in a way, try and address the question, what does research tell us about these particular problems? And it will have to be very brief because of obviously the limitations of time. But again, what I hope is by talking about what we understand about the cause, it will help you reflect on how you then support your son and daughter or the person that you're caring for with Prader-Willi syndrome. The dilemma again is I can't imagine all the possible scenarios that you might face on a day-to-day basis. So it's not possible for me to say, well, if this happens, you should do this. What I want to do is to allow you to think to yourself, well, if this happens, how can I use what I've learned from this talk and develop my own strategies for helping my son or daughter? This is the thinking behind this. So with hyperphagia, this is a slide I often show. This is the weight chart of the first person I ever saw with Prader-Willi syndrome when I was a trainee psychiatrist in London. And at age 18 in 1981, she left the family home to live in a hostel for people with intellectual disabilities. And she put on large amounts of weight, scary amounts of weight. And I was asked to see her. And I had never heard of Prader-Willi syndrome. And so I obviously rushed to the books. And in those days, you had to go to books. There wasn't the internet. Things have changed. And I went to the UK Prader-Willi Syndrome Association, which was fairly young then. And I went to the parents. And the parents said to me, of course this happened. Because I said to the staff, you need to control access to food. And they refused to do so. And this led to the first study that I ever did on Prader-Willi syndrome, in which we had a control group of people without Prader-Willi syndrome and a group of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And we gave them access to food for an hour. And we looked at what happened. And most of the people who didn't have Prader-Willi syndrome, like you and I, you eat quite rapidly for a while, you begin to feel full, you lose the drive to eat because you're no longer hungry, and you stop eating. But for the vast majority of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, this didn't happen. And this has been shown in many other studies as well. And the argument is that in people with Prader-Willi syndrome, there's an abnormality of what's called the Satiety Cascade. Satiation is when you stop eating. You feel full and you no longer feel hungry. Yes.
Even voor de vertaling, satiety is verzadiging. Voor de mensen die denken, wat betekent dat woord? I'm just translating satiety.
Good, thank you. And the body has developed a number of feedback mechanisms so that when food enters your mouth, your stomach, your intestines, there are a whole set of processes that are bringing about a change in the brain in terms of how you feel about whether you feel hungry or not. And this is sort of illustrated here. Here's the brain, the hypothalamus is in here, there's the gut, there's fat cells, all these, as well as the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve runs between the gut, the heart, the lungs, and the brain. All of these are feeding back to the brain, and the brain in turn is feeding back to these organs. And then conscious feelings of hunger are represented in the surface of the brain and begin to change as you eat. And this is the system that I mentioned earlier that has been developed through evolution to allow us to match our food intake with our energy expenditure. And this is what's faulty in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. We don't understand why that is as yet, although I think we're getting closer to it. And I think it's very important to state that hyperphagia is a consequence of a biological impairment of the ability of the brain to limit energy or food intake in line with your energy needs. It's not someone with Prader-Willi syndrome being difficult or awkward or stubborn. They do not have the biological mechanisms that you and I have that tell us when to stop eating. And that is why they need an external support for that, which we would call food security. Now, one of the interesting issues is, why is that different sometimes between people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and why might that vary a bit? But I think brain imaging studies as well as observational studies are very clear about this. And that is why you as an organization, IPSWO and other national organizations, will be saying to people, food security is important. Because if you allow free access to food, for many people, not necessarily all people with Prader-Willi syndrome, severe obesity will develop So we need to take control. Now, of course, there are treatment trials for hyperphagia that are aiming to interact with the hypothalamus to try and improve that. But at present, it is really not treatment. What it's about is management. It's managing access to food to prevent obesity. And food security is more than just physical security, it's emotional security. It is the person with Prader-Willi syndrome not only knowing that they can't get access to food, but also knowing that food will be available. Because if you're hungry, the worst thing for you is to believe that food is not going to be available. And that makes you more aroused and anxious and so on. I now want to move and look at the issue of temper outbursts, because I think for some families, temper outbursts have become a bigger problem than the hyperphagia, because they can manage the hyperphagia through the food environment. These outbursts can be frequent. At their more severe, they can cause harm to the person or sometimes to others. They certainly impact on quality of life, impact on costs. And certainly we've had situations where someone's behavior has led to involvement of the criminal justice system. At present, I think the interventions are still really rather limited. Many of them are around the principles of what's called applied behavioral analysis, and I'll come back to that. I think food security may help the behavior outbursts as well. And of course, you see, certainly in people with severe outbursts, often the rather excessive and I think quite often inappropriate use of medications. That as a starting point, I think there are very few medications that are really valuable here. But the challenge for us, I think, is we have limited understanding of causation. And one of the problems is with behavioral interventions is how do you maintain them over time? Here's just some data. Work in Australia by Lauren Rice, and she surveyed over 100 families. She found that these behavior problems tended to get worse in adolescence, that they had a very particular course that I think you would recognize of them building up into an outburst, and then at the end of the outburst, often tears and distress. Often they're triggered by what you call goal blockage. So some expectation, something was going to happen, but it wasn't possible for whatever reason. Or some sense of injustice, either perceived or real. You promised me this, and now it's not possible. Or by difficulties dealing with change. The bus doesn't arrive, and therefore you've got to have a different activity that day. And what she found too in this study is that what parents were saying to us, that when these outbursts occurred, that giving space or distracting, if that's possible, was really the only effective intervention, that medications were used, but they were considered of limited value. This is another study by Kate Woodcock in the United Kingdom, and here she found that temper outbursts were often related to what she called cognitive challenges. Sorry, that should be cognitive here. If you are required to switch your attention. And this comes back to the cognitive problems that people with Prader-Willi syndrome have. You and I take for granted the ability that if we suddenly have to pay attention to something else, we can do that by and large. But for a person with Prader-Willi syndrome, that requires a much greater effort. It's cognitively demanding for them, and therefore may well be associated with increase in arousal and ultimately in a temper outburst. So unexpected change is often leads to cognitive challenge and in turn to a temper outburst. So that begins to give you some idea about how you might approach this, and I'll come back to that. This is a very different thing, and vagus nerve stimulation is something that's been used to treat epilepsy, and we used it to see if it would help the overeating behavior, and it didn't, is the answer to that. And we used what's called an implanted, bit like a pacemaker, vagus nerve stimulation. But in the first study we did, to our surprise, we found that 2 of the 3 people who took part reported significant improvements in behavior. And we did a second study using an external stimulator that you wear for 4 hours each day. an electrode in the ear that stimulates what's called the auricular branch of the vagus nerve. And vagus nerve stimulation takes a long time to have an effect when it treats epilepsy. But here what we found, and we were looking at tempers. This is before they had stimulation, and this is the rate of tempers each week or each day, 3 months after stimulation, between 3 and 6 months, 6 and 9 months, and 9 months to a year. And what you find in 4 of the participants, of the 5 participants, it came down, the rates came down. In this person it didn't, but in these person, and in fact 3 of these 4 people continue to use vagus nerve stimulation, and one of them is the picture here that I showed earlier, is doing very well. And here's some quotes. Before you couldn't challenge him on certain things, but now you can, and he's prepared to sit and listen. And for some of you, you'll sit there and gasp, is that possible? Because we do know that for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, that's a big problem. I think the other important thing about this is that it is telling us something about the cause of outbursts in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. So the model that Kate Woodcock has put forward, you've got the genetics of Prader-Willi syndrome. It affects brain development. It makes it difficult to switch attention. Something happens in the environment, a change. You get increased physiological arousal. And what she argues is sometimes people with Prader-Willi syndrome might use repetitive questioning as a way of trying initially to cope with it. But eventually they lose control. And I think when you look at intervention, what she is doing is trying to help people with Prader-Willi syndrome to train them to prepare for change. Now, you can't always, of course, predict change. So that's why if you can give them the skills to manage their feelings when change happens, that's going to be more effective. What I think vagus nerve stimulation does, and some other psychological interventions, it helps to reduce the physiological arousal, and therefore you get a reduction in the severity or even the absence of temper outbursts. So I think we're still at an early stage here, but here I've summarized some of the key aspects around the temper outbursts. But I think the approach still is to try and identify what triggers, what predispose to these outbursts, and what triggers them and precipitates them, and what circumstances may make them worse, how you manage them, and so on and so forth. So do they occur at times of change? If so, what particular issues seem to trigger them in your son or daughter, as opposed to everyone with Prader-Willi syndrome? Can you improve, can you manage change more effectively? You want to treat what I've called comorbid psychopathology. So if they are depressed, then you might want to treat that perhaps with medication, but with great care. And then I think there are interventions that are altering the autonomic nervous system. That is the balance between what's called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. VNS, psychological techniques. Yesterday I had a long talk with family that are using touch and using massage to help their child. And it's a lot of thinking now is that type of thing may well be affecting the vagus nerve and affecting the way people respond to threat. So improving the autonomic nervous system, if you like.
Can I just add something, Tony? The vagus nerve therapy. Now, there are 3 people in the UK using this.
There were 3 that had the implanted device, 2 of whom did very well with their behavior. And they, in fact, are continuing to have it switched on. It's like a pacemaker, really. And it's been on now for nearly 10 years in their case. And then this second study, and when we did the second study, there were these new external stimulators.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that you wear for 4 hours each day. And there we've got 4 out of 5 people did very well. And 3 of them are continuing to use them and are doing, their behavior seems to be much better. But that's the limit of research at the moment. So it's not in universal use.
No, because I was thinking in the Netherlands, would it be interesting to have research done on the vagus nerve with the system as well.
Absolutely.
It seems
Absolutely.
a promising therapy. Monique.
I think it's very promising, and we really should see more. There's a group in France that's beginning to do something.
Yeah.
And I think a group in Germany as well.
So
I think, I'm very excited by
that. I can just see a hand raised. Monique.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you for your story, Mr. Holland. I was wondering, because I don't think at our son of 15 that change is a cause for his outburst. Right. So we think that the stress and the arousal in the environment, that is probably a cause. Yes. But do you have any other explanations for outburst?
Right. I think that's a really interesting observation. The way I think about it is that the threshold in people with Prader-Willi syndrome for emotional arousal is low. So things that you and I would cope with, and which actually one needs to cope with, because it's a problem if you can't. People with Prader-Willi syndrome can't cope with. And I think if you sometimes think about it, that if you're hungry and if in your mind you're thinking about food, that is going to make you on edge. I think in English we'd use the phrase on edge, and I think that's sometimes what happens with people with Prader-Willi syndrome. They're sort of on edge. So they are disturbed by things that wouldn't affect us. And very quickly, they go from being mildly irritated to being very
from 0 to 100. Yeah.
And I think what vagus nerve stimulation does, and other ways of stimulating the vagus, is raise that threshold. So they become more resilient to what's going on in the environment. That's the way I think about it. Whether that's correct, I think one can debate, but that's for me is a useful model.
Yeah, that explains more for us than change, I think. Thank you.
I think just to move on to skin picking, I think again, and I'm going to more quickly deal with these issues, but I think here again, there's a biological environmental relationship. So I think for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, there's some suggestion that they have impaired perception of bodily sensations, what's known as interoception. So it's sometimes referred to as sensory hunger. So in order to get sensation, they may need a stronger stimulus than you and I need. But I think there's a second problem here, that they have an increased pain threshold. So you and I, if we started picking our skin, the pain would stop us. But for someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, there isn't that adverse consequence. So I think that's sort of part of the biology of skin picking. But also, as I'll show you in a moment, there's some evidence that lack of activity and other things in the environment can shape when skin picking takes place. Skin picking becomes a way sometimes of communicating need. But I think, again, there's a biological vulnerability and there's environmental factors. This is a study by someone called Scott.
Sorry, can I just interrupt before you go on the skin picking? Joanna Fink just wanted to know the age of the 3 people taking part in the vagus nerve research. So
they were all adults. They were all adults, so 18 and above. The group in France has started using it, looking at children with it, and clearly a study should be done in children. Vagus nerve stimulation to treat epilepsy is used in children. It's been shown to be safe in children, but no one has done a study and published a study as yet using it to treat the tempers in children with Prader-Willi syndrome.
Thank you.
So this is a study by someone called Scott Hall, and what he showed, these are 8 people with Prader-Willi syndrome who skin picked. And this is the bar shows the rate of skin picking or the amount of skin picking. And what he found was if people were in a situation where they were being ignored or if they were alone, then skin picking rates were much higher. and this was true, I think, really of virtually everyone here. Whereas when they were in situations where people were paying them attention or interacting with them and so on, skin picking was much, much lower. And what that shows, again, is that in trying to look at how you intervene with skin picking, one of the questions you need to ask yourself is, can we identify particular environmental conditions where skin picking is worse and other conditions where it is better? And therefore, can we change the environment? So if someone skin picks when they haven't got much activity, now obviously you can't have activity all the time. But I remember an example of someone who got someone to start knitting because when they were using their hands, they couldn't skin pick. So, that's the sort of way you need to think about it. So again, it's an interaction. People have done what's called a functional analysis, looking at what circumstances trigger skin picking and the implications of that. Skin picking is worse if someone has a depression, and sometimes you need to treat that. I think treatments to the skin to try and stop itching can sometimes be important. And then there's some work by Jennifer Miller, for example, which used a particular medication that acts on a certain neurotransmitter in the brain, the glutamatergic system. Now, that she claimed quite benefits. Acetylcysteine, the medication was called, but it was an open trial. It wasn't a blind trial. So I think at present, the jury is still out on whether there are chemical interventions, if you like.
I think in the Netherlands now there's new research trying to see if there is medication that might affect the skin picking. The Dutch group is doing that, yes.
Again, I think that's needed. One of the problems I think in Prader-Willi syndrome is we don't always know the biology of these things. So it's very difficult to know how to design what the intervention should be. And often it is chance observation that makes you think about trying something. But you really do need formal trials, because these behaviors will often improve for non-specific reasons. Sometimes you see in a trial things seem to get things better, but it isn't actually the agent that it's doing it. It's some other effect of just being in a trial. Now, I want to just look at psychosis in someone, and this is a description of someone I saw with Prader-Willi syndrome and who became mentally unwell very rapidly. This was some years ago now. And over some hours, there was this marked deterioration in his mental state in the group home where he lived. He became confused, and in English, I think the best word to describe it was bewildered. He became much more anxious than he normally is, and he became unable to talk coherently, and he was using words that just didn't really fit the circumstances, blackmail and things. And he was seen in the accident and emergency department, and they thought he had something called a confusional state, which comes with physical illness, and they gave him antibiotics, but he really didn't get better. And he started using other words. He started grabbing at things, like he thought he saw a butterfly and was grabbing at it. And eventually a psychotic illness was diagnosed. He was started on an antipsychotic, in this case aripiprazole. And after a while, his mood improved and he did well. And by and large, he's done well over the years, although he's had a couple of relapses. But the reason for showing this is that it is there's indication that it's quite common, but particularly in people with UPD. And this was a study done by Sarita Soni in the UK, in which she looked at a group of adults with Prader-Willi syndrome, and she found that about 60% had psychotic episodes in those who had the UPD, and it was just under 20% in those with deletion. And there have been many other studies, and I list these here because some of these you might recognize the people. So in Belgium, Annick Vogels, Harm Bohr is Dutch, and he's done studies. He lives in the UK, and he did the first study with us in the UK, but he's also done studies in the Netherlands. Verhoeven, of course, is Dutch. I think Cinema is Dutch as well, and so on. But there are a number of studies that have confirmed this observation. And the point I want to leave you with here is mental illness is treatable. The problem is people don't recognize it, but it is treatable. It's a good message. Obviously, it would be better if it didn't happen, but by and large, it's a good message. But it presents with a deterioration in behavior and the onset of new bizarre behavior. And treatments are primarily initially around medication. So being aware of the time here, I want to just now move us more into some summary data about interventions and treatment. But this is the conceptual model that I think is the way thinking about it. You've got the genetics of Prader-Willi syndrome and certain genes or a gene that's not working, if you like, that impacts on brain development. And there are three ways that impacts on brain development. One is impacts on the hypothalamus and on homeostasis, the ability to regulate. It impairs the brain in a way that impacts on cognition, the person's ability to make sense of the world. And particularly in those with UPD, it impacts in a way, and we don't fully understand this, for different genetic reasons to increase your risk of psychotic illness. So your treatments may be biological, medications where there's a good reason, so medication to treat psychotic illness. Occasionally medication to manage anxiety, although that I think is disputed, or something like vagus nerve stimulation that is affecting the hypothalamus and the autonomic nervous system. But much at the moment is in the environment. It's environmental and psychological interventions that may include early intervention to help your child learn to cope with change. It may include environmental change, and I'll come to some of these in a moment, or other psychological interventions. It's essentially about trying to make the environment more predictable for the person with Prader-Willi syndrome and less threatening for them. So it brings down their arousal level, for example.
Tony, there are two questions in the chat. Anonymous asks, can skin picking also occur during sleep? And why can it be more severe before sleeping when normally the child sleeps very quickly?
That's a really interesting point, and I'm not certain the answer to that. I think it possibly can occur during sleep, possibly probably not in the deepest sleep, but in the lighter sleep. But I don't know, and I'll ask around about that. But you certainly hear stories of it occurring at night, because you hear, particularly with something like rectal picking, of blood in the sheets and so on. I think, again, remember, these things are dimensions. So there are going to be some people with Prader-Willi syndrome in which the biological risks of skin picking are much higher, and other people, the biological risks are lower, but the environment is higher. So if someone, has a very high pain threshold, for example, they may be much more likely to continue skin picking, and it may occur in any number of circumstances without having to be something to do with the environment. So in the end, you have to ask yourself, how do I best understand it in this person with Prader-Willi syndrome? What's most important here? Is the environment most important, and what can we do about it? Is the biology more important, and what can we do about it? That's the judgment, I think, that has to be made.
There's another question of Joanne Vink. I think it relates to the psychosis slide. Does imprinting disorder fall under UPD statistics?
Yes, it does. And having a imprinting center defect, in a sense, is a bit like having a disomy, but only a very small part of chromosome 15. So effectively, yes, it does. Of course, there's very little data specifically on people with imprinting center defects because it's so much rarer. But we've certainly seen people with imprinting center defects who've had a mental illness. So we think of it in a similar way as the UPD.
Monique, had jij nog een vraag of was je hand gewoon nog niet weg?
Nee, ik had nog een vraag, ja.
Monique
So
has
our
another
son is
question.
using Abilify. He did use Risperidone, but he was getting very hungry.
Right.
He got the medication because of the Gilles de la Tourette. So I was wondering, when you want to give antipsychotic medication for the children with UPD, all those medication has a side effect of getting more hungry and gaining weight.
Yeah.
So how do you?
I think this is a real dilemma, and of course the prescribing of any medication, whether it's an antibiotic or whatever, is a balance between risk and benefit. I think there are certain antipsychotic medications that you avoid. Olanzapine, I don't know whether it's called that in the Netherlands, but olanzapine is particularly bad in terms of stimulating appetite and causing obesity. So I would always avoid that. But I think in the end, what you have to do is you may have to try different medications, because it may be rather unique for the person with Prader-Willi syndrome which one is best for them. If it's simply a matter that they put on at risk of putting on weight, you can perhaps control that through food security. The problem arises is if it seems to drive their hunger even more.
Yeah.
They sort of seek out food more than they did. Then it becomes very problematic. So no, you're right. This is a problem. But psychosis is very serious.
It's also a big problem. Yeah, of course.
It's also a big problem. So it's
a catch-22.
A catch-22. I think again in English, swings and roundabouts would be another phrase to use. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So if we think about interventions, you think about environmental interventions, which is really about optimizing understanding and reducing uncertainty. So structured timetable, visual timetables are a way of, if you remember, if someone with Prader-Willi syndrome has a problem with time, when I say to you this, tomorrow or in 2 weeks' time, you know what that means. That may be very difficult for someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. But putting it in a structured timetable makes it much clearer. We know that people with Prader-Willi syndrome respond better to visual information than auditory information. The way you use language, I think irony and certain types of humor may be a problem for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. So, you need to be more concrete and more, if you like, at one level, more simple in the use of language. You need to ask yourself, do I understand what makes the risk of certain behaviors, such as temper outbursts, increase the risk? What triggers them? What maintains them over time? You need to look at whether, as new research comes to fruition, is there early intervention I can do? Are there particular training strategies that help my son or daughter manage these outbursts? What's really important, though, I think, is that you as parents have an agreed strategy for how you are going to manage them when they do occur. And that when your son or daughter is able to discuss it, you might try and agree with them what that should be. But you don't want to do that when they're just coming out of one or when they're just going into one. You need the certainty of what to do, and they need the certainty of what is going to happen. And I think that's really important. Always look at physical issues that may be important, like sleep apnea can make people more irritable, and treatment of psychiatric illness is really very important. Just to finally say that I think there are really exciting things in the future. I think there are potentials for new treatments. So I want to end this talk in this positive light, and I genuinely believe that. There's some very interesting work, for example, around the use of oxytocin. I think the whole area of what's called pharmacogenomics will help the way we use medication. I don't think that's relevant myself yet for Prader-Willi syndrome. And I think advances in neurosciences, when we apply those to Prader-Willi syndrome, will help us understand what atypical brain development, what causes it, and the consequences of that, and lead us to a better understanding of the mechanisms that underpin these problems. I'm going to skip the next slide, which was about oxytocin because of time. But just I want to end my talk by just thanking many people over the years with Prader-Willi syndrome and their families and their paid care providers for help with the research we've done, research assistants and the funders for research. And thank you very much for taking the trouble to sign into this webinar and listen to me going on for a long time and perhaps a little too fast at times, and I apologize for that. And thank you, and any comments or questions would be welcome.
Well, first of all, Tony, thank you so much for taking time to explaining and shedding new light on the behaviors we as parents and caregivers know so extremely well. Just before we open up the mic, maybe for more questions, there's still one question in the chat. Somebody says, some children have invisible friends when they are younger. Until which age would it be normal with children with PWS?
To have friends, to have imaginary friends.
Yes.
Yes. Now, again, that's interesting. I think, first of all, one thing to think about here is that if you've got delayed brain development, then the things that are part of normal childhood development, such as having imaginary friends, such as having temper outbursts, and in English we talk about the terrible twos. We know that 2-year-old and 3-year-old, and they're the age of my grandchildren at the present, and I'm seeing them go through the terrible twos at the present. But these things may continue for longer. And this person I mentioned, who I talked to their family yesterday, their daughter is 6 and she's having outbursts, and they're exactly like the terrible twos. So the same will be true for these imaginary friends, that people may retain them for longer than you would normally expect. And imaginary friends are not the same as the sort of delusions and hallucinations of psychosis. Imaginary friends, the person relates to in a comfortable, generally in a very comfortable way. They are friends, whereas often hallucinations and delusions are very distressing for someone. And they're not seen, they're seen in a very different way. And often a psychosis will develop quite suddenly, whereas imaginary friends are something that the person has had for many years. So it's usually quite possible to make a distinction between them.
Thank you. That's a very clear answer. Thank you very much. We have another comment from Wilma Rikink, who writes, my daughter had a serious psychosis in March. Of course, very sorry to hear about that. Just after her second vaccination. Is this chance or not? Is there a relationship between the two?
Now, that's again, there's some really interesting questions here. We, just as a slight digression, through IPSWE, we did a study of COVID when people with Prader-Willi syndrome got COVID. And there's been a publication from France about this as well. And we think actually people with Prader-Willi syndrome, generally, if they've got COVID, are very mildly affected. I mean, we predicted that there would be perhaps a much higher mortality rate, because of respiratory problems, obesity and diabetes and so on. We haven't found that. But also many families, I don't know what your experience has been, is that people with Prader-Willi syndrome have had virtually no side effects from the vaccine. But having said that, we've had a lot of stories that people will say to us just before they became ill, they had an infection of some sort. And we do know that psychosis, that there's a theory that psychotic illness may be due to inflammatory reactions in the brain. So it's possible, but equally, these things could be by chance. It is very difficult to know the relationship, but it's an interesting observation. But one observation by itself, of course, one would want to see if there's a consistent observation along those lines, but there may be something to it.
Thank you, Wilma, for sharing that. Thank you. Nele Austin has a question. Can compulsive behavior and other changes in behavior be a forerunner of psychosis?
I think we're still learning about that. But I think that if you see a change in, say, a deterioration, an increase in obsessive compulsive behavior, particularly if it's associated with changes in mood, fluctuations in mood, and the person is different than you have known them to be before. The thing about psychosis, it changes the person. Temper tantrums are temper tantrums. They're the same in a 6-year-old as they are, in a 20-year-old. They may be more difficult in a 20-year-old. But a psychosis is a fundamental change. So if you see that someone's existing problems, such as repetitive and ritualistic behaviors, or their temper outbursts, are getting worse, at the very least, you should ask yourself, why is that? Now, it may be because something's changed in their environment. It may be a physical illness, and one should always be aware of possible physical illness, because, as you know, physical illness can be hidden because of the high pain threshold and lack of vomiting and so on. But it could also be an indication that something more serious, such as a mental illness, is developing. But you would just need to, under those circumstances, I think, watch it carefully, really.
Yes, thank you. I'm just looking at the time. It's 20 minutes past 9. We are very grateful that you're giving your extra time already, Tony. Just before we maybe wrap up, are there any questions? Feel free to ask them in Dutch as well, because it's a great opportunity to have you here and to get some answers. Yes, I can see somebody raising their hand. Joanne Vink, could you please unmute?
Okay. Hello, I have a question, 2 questions. Since using medication, my son has a trouble to begin his sentence. And so he starts with and then he says his sentence perfectly well.
Yes.
But is it just because it's more time to process, or is this a compulsive behavior in the meantime? Or
right.
What about, he doesn't stutter once he gets up to speed.
He's then fluent after that.
Right.
Yes. And the medication, was it a psychiatric medication?
Yes.
I mean, we do know that some of the psychiatric medications can have an effect on what you might call motor function. And of course, speaking, and it requires motor coordination. In some of the older fashioned psychiatric medications cause tremor, for example. And one of the problems, I think, is, again, because people with Prader-Willi syndrome have an atypical brain development, it may be that they're a little more prone to some of those more neurological problems associated with such medication than you or I would be. And I think the answer is there's a lot of uncertainty here, but I think it's not an unreasonable question that this may be the explanation. Can I ask, and I don't feel you have to answer this, but did he have a mental illness, and is that why he was put on the medication?
Yes, all of a sudden, out of the blue, he had constipation and became psychotic with no previous history. We never suspected it. Maybe a little bit of dip in the fall,
right.
But it just came out of nowhere, and this medication was necessary to treat that.
I think if he's seeing a psychiatrist for that, then I think you should just talk to them about this issue of the speech. I mean, whilst, as I say, there's a balance between risk and benefit here, and generally, if someone's been psychotic, you don't want to reduce or stop the medication too quickly. No. But there might be a point in which the psychiatrist would say, let's try reducing it and let's see whether the speech improves. And then you can test out your theory that it's the medication that's causing this.
I have a second question. We recently heard on the news 2 weeks ago that there's a new study on twins and the cause, how twins came about in Nature Communication from the university. There's some kind of flag on the DNA. Right, I'm sure you've heard about that, but I was wondering what consequence that might have for us. We have imprinting disorder. For these flags seeing as it's a serious problem with twins and mental illness, etc.
Right. I mean, I'm a twin myself, by the way. I often wondered why we weren't called double Dutch, which means which means something's incomprehensible, because Dutch to most of us is completely incomprehensible. Right. But that's a really interesting, and I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that one of the big areas of development in genetics is imprinting, because imprinting is what determines whether genes are expressed or not. And one of the ideas ultimately is, could you reverse Prader-Willi syndrome or prevent it by changing the imprinting status of the chromosome, of the chromosome 15. So that I think, any research on what causes imprinting and the impact of imprinting, I think could ultimately have benefits, but I think it's a long way off. It's very complicated. And the problem with Prader-Willi syndrome is that the problems arise from conception. The baby with Prader-Willi syndrome already is floppy, is not moving normally. So whatever you need to do, you really need to do in utero. And that's the real challenge for prevention, for fundamental treatments such as altering imprinting.
Thank you, Joanna. There are some more questions, and I would like to give some time to the question. What, to your opinion, is the best way to one question above. Is it better to avoid changes as much as possible, or just face them so that the people with PWS can really learn from it?
Well, that's now the person that's done some really interesting work on that is Kate Woodcock in Birmingham. And the teaching I think for many years has been try and keep the environment consistent and try and avoid change. But then, exactly as the questioner suggested, that means the person never learns to manage change. So I think increasingly the idea is that you try and come up with a way of helping the person to cope with change. And the main reason for that is, of course, you can't always predict when change is going to happen. So I think actually in the end it's going to be a combination.
I think
you want stability.
Yes, Marielle and I wrote something about it also, exactly what you're saying now. It's about the balance, and we also give some strategies to kind of play around with how can you train change without putting too much stress on people with PWS.
I think one of the things Kate is doing is she's making change routine. One of the things they've done is hold up a change card. So what it's doing is it's making change predictable.
Yes.
And therefore the person's arousal stays down. They're able to manage it. Because some of the problem is around of cognitive processing. If it takes them longer, what you've got to try and do is help them keep calm whilst they're processing what's going on. And that's the strategy, I think.
Yes.
May I ask another question about that?
Yeah.
Because I can imagine that, I have also 2 other children, 9 and 11 years old. And sometimes they, my daughter is 5 years old. She has PWS. And also my other 2 children are sometimes the cause of, the reason why she's getting upset.
Yes.
And that's not always avoidable. So, is that a good thing, or is that something that we also should try to avoid as well?
It reminds me of now. I am now a grandparent. Is that you walk away, and that's a bit like my experience as a psychiatrist. I go in, I give these words of wisdom, then I walk away, and you're faced still with trying to manage the situation. Absolutely. But I do think one of the things is to help the siblings understand the issues as well, so that whilst they will still engage in teasing or whatever it is, they may be able to do it in a way that is less provoking, or there may be a time in which they say to themselves, well, it's just not worth doing this, and I'm going to be a little more sensible about it. But do help your siblings understand what it is, that it's not their brother or sister that's just being particularly awkward, although it feels like that. They do have these additional problems that make it really problematic in terms of how they manage their behavior.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
What's, in your opinion, is the best way to respond to angry behavior in people with PWS?
Right. I mean, it's partly, if you think of angry behavior, perhaps it's the same as it's a gradation of temper outbursts. I mean, I think one thing to remember that if someone with Prader-Willi syndrome is already cognitively impaired a bit, so they struggle to deal with issues. Now, if they're also getting angry, they're going to be even more impaired. It's going to be even harder for them to deal with whatever it is. So as a general rule, if someone's getting angry, this is not the time to try and say to them, you must do this, or try and explain to them why this is the case. So as a general rule, I think the approach is to say, I can see that you're getting upset. I think it's better if you try and calm, and there may be an exercise you can prompt them to do. And when things are calm, let's sit down and let's think about it. And let's think about how we could have done this differently. But I think men, this is stereotyping, but men may be a little worse than women about this. Men sometimes think they want the last word here, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. And actually the truth is, you're never going to win. It's much better to swallow your pride a bit, back off, and then when they're calm, you say, let's think about this. What could we have done? What could you have done differently? What could we have done differently? If you engage, you're probably going to escalate the problem, and it's probably going to continue for longer than it would have had. Now, it's much more difficult, of course, if the person's behavior is serious and is breaking up furniture or hurting themselves, then that's a problem.
Thank you. We have one last question. What is the average age of psychosis onset in people with PWS?
Right. There's a little bit of disagreement about this in the literature. The group in Belgium report that it's in the early teens. We ourselves find it in the late teens or the early 20s. But you do find some people who, certainly there are people with disomy who never develop psychosis and they grow into old age, and there are other people who may get it in their 30s. But by and large, we think it's in the teenage years or perhaps the early 20s. But I think we're still learning about that. I think the other thing to say is, again, our research and other people's research was again done with the older generation. And we don't know whether children, people now who are 5, 6 or 7, whether their risk will be quite the same because life has been better. They've had growth hormone and so on and so forth. It may be that things will improve by simply having better and more effective treatment around things like growth hormone.
That's really interesting. I think also very interesting for us as parents that you really see a change in the generations of Prader-Willis growing up.
Yes,
the more we know,
we don't know for certain, but I do think you're seeing a different generation of children now.
Well, I think somebody wrote already in the chat a huge thank you very much. And if there are no more questions, I think a warm, silent applause to you, Tony. And thank you also so much to everybody for joining us on this very important topic. And I thought it was very interesting, the first slide you started with having a far more broader sense of well-being for the ones we love, and how we can really increase and enhance that well-being. And I think that's, as a parent, is always something you're thinking about. I also want to give a huge applause to the Dutch PWS organization and the International PWS organization for making this possible, for organizing the Zoom session. So thank you so much. And I actually forgot to say something very important. So I said Marielle and I wrote the book, but many parents contributed to the book and many professionals as well. So I would really like to acknowledge the group effort of writing that book. Now, if you're interested in the Behavioral Alert book, please send an email to Sandra. Maybe Sandra, you can put your email address in the chat, and we will send you a booklet. Just say which age your child is or the person you're caring for is, and we will send you a booklet. Then the last reminder, coming November the 9th, there will be a next Zoom session, probably with somebody you know well, Tony, with Norbert Stuntebek from Germany. And he will be talking about the complex and challenging behavior as well from his perspective and from all the knowledge that has been gathered in Germany. So we're very much looking forward to welcoming him as well. So we have come to an end. Once again, thank you so much for everything, for listening, for joining us, and trying to make life better for the ones we love. So hope to see you again on the 9th of November.
Well,
That's it. And stay tuned, Tony, because there's some very nice messages for you in the chat from people.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And thank you for all your questions. They were really interesting questions. Great.
Yes.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.